It's that time of the year again. Forced rotation for all your Eternal formats with new broken Modern Horizons 3 cards. Let's see what Wasi cooked up this time. All right, let's start off with a bang. One of the most important cycles in every Modern Horizons set is the pitch spell cycle. In Modern Horizons 1, it was the forces, and in Modern Horizons 2, it was the elementals. And here in Modern Horizons 3, we have the flares. So the flares are overall very weak in comparison to the other sets of Modern Horizons pitch cycles. And the reason is their alternate casting cost to cast the spell for free is sacrificing a non-token creature of the color of the flare. And that is a huge cost. Just an absolutely huge cost. One of the basic reasons it's going to be super hard is because the reason the elementals and the forces that see play are very good is because they truly cost 0. They cost a card from your hand, not a card from play. Any non-token blue creature or any color creature in play is going to already cost you something. And by already costing you something, it's no longer really getting a free spell, and it's definitely ruling out, say, the ability to play this on turn 0 on your opponent's first turn of the game when you're on the draw. That being said, the blue one is probably the most playable because it is blue. It is a counter spell, and it is just a straight up cancel if you don't pay its alternate cost. And its alternate cost, sacking a blue creature, can theoretically be done in a way that doesn't cost you mana. The number one way you would do that is if you were to return a Narcomoeba from your graveyard. A Narcomoeba being a non-token blue creature, you can sack the Narcomoeba and counter target spell. So people are theorizing that this card could be played in Dredge. I'm pretty skeptical of that. If you play this card in Dredge, it's never going to be on turn 0, like we talked about, because you'll never have an Narcomoeba in the graveyard. In fact, it won't even be on turn 1 most of the time, because most of the time you activate your Bazaar and you put cards in your yard, and you can't trigger the Narcomoeba until you start dredging cards. You could theoretically dredge an Narcomoeba on turn 1 if you put a Grave Troll or another dredger in your yard and you cast something like a Cataxian's Probe or a Cycle to Street Wraith and use dredge. But I think you already have enough blue forces with Force of Will, Force of Negation, and Mindbreak Trap that I don't think this will see play. But it's definitely the most likely of the flares to see play. I will say that there is another flare that is at least interesting to talk about, and this flare of cultivation. So this is a cultivate. So the first one was a cancel, classic Magic the Gathering card. This one is a cultivate, though I guess to be fair, it is differently costed than cultivate. But sacking a non-token green creature and searching for 2 basic lands, one into play tapped, one into your hand. If you do this for 0 mana, it can be pretty reasonable. I think one of the real ways you could use this card is something like the Nickfit creature. Veteran Explorer, where you sacrifice it and you get 2 basic lands into play, and so does your opponent. Doing some kind of ramping here into a deck that cares about land drops. Maybe there's something you could do with that in Vintage. Historically, and this is one of the big reasons why Fastbond doesn't see a lot of play in Vintage, you are trying to really cut out lands from your decks because they are typically less powerful than playing things cheaply and freely. So the idea of playing a Fastbond, which requires lots of lands in your deck, or other cards where number of lands matter, those kind of cards typically just don't see play in Vintage because they're not really capitalizing on what the format is bringing. There's another cycle. There is a cycle of flip planeswalkers that start as low-costed creatures. Now, this is a very interesting prospect because all of these creatures fit under the constraints of Lurrus, and Lurrus is one of the most broken and powerful cards in Vintage. So it's definitely very interesting to see if you can find any of these flip walkers and have them actually be playable in your Lurrus deck. And I would say most of them are not very strong. The Ajani is something that is like kind of cute and fun. But a lot of the flip sides of the walkers are kind of underwhelming. Even the blue walker requires a lot of work if you're not playing Brainstorm, and the flip side of it wasn't very good. I would say the flip walker with the most potential is this one. It's Grist as a larva. So it's kind of hard to get flipped, but if it enters the battlefield under your control and entered from the graveyard, or you cast it from your graveyard, or another creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard or cast from your graveyard, you can pay a green and you can flip this Grist. This Grist flips into a planeswalker that has a very important -2. Its -2 that can be used right away is destroy target artifact or enchantment. This kind of disenchant effect is very, very strong in Vintage right now, primarily due to the fact that Urza Saga exists. To be fair, destroying artifacts or enchantments has always been pretty reasonable in Vintage, but I would say right now it's probably the best disenchant has ever been. So making 1/1 insects and giving them death touch and milling cards, not usually a huge deal, but fueling graveyard based strategies. But I would say -2 disenchant is worth maybe trying to get, and you can flip this in a variety of ways. Like even something like a blood gas coming back from your yard could enable this. Green, not typically a color used in Luris, but it has been in the past, so maybe there's like a Deathrite Shaman Luris deck that might want this. I would say it's not likely, but I do think that this card out of the cycle is probably the most Vintage viable. Disruptor Flute. Disruptor Flute is a flash artifact, and the card you name costs 3 more. That is symmetrical, and activated abilities of that card can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. So I don't think this is a super strong card, but it is a castable colorless artifact, which makes it a lot more interesting because you have Workshop and Ancient Tomb and Moxen, Mana Crypt and Soul Ring. I don't typically think that this like style of effect, like Anointed Peacekeeper almost, is very good usually. Kind of feels narrow, but there are a lot of activated abilities right now in Vintage, and historically things like Bazaar of Baghdad are not going to have 3 mana to ever. Sorry, that's not how this works. And this just turns off Bazaar of Baghdad. So yeah, maybe this has enough versatility to be a card you have in your board in your Ancient Tomb or Heavy Moxen deck as Bizarre Hate, but also doubles as being good across the field. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see where someone would choose to use this. One thing it doesn't have that something like what's the Spyglass? It's called Spyglass. 2 mana, you get to look at their hand and then get to turn off an activated ability name. This thing has doesn't have the ability to look at your opponent's hand, but it does have flash. And it does have, like making spells cost more and like pseudo turning them off. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on. And if you have a Heavy Moxen or a Workshop deck that is looking to answer a certain problem, this card may come up as a solution to your problem. So I think this is a good card for people to know about, and maybe it'll become up as an answer. Something I've always been parroting recently is that Vintage has a very deep card pool, and if your deck can't beat something or is struggling with a certain card or effect or something like that, there's likely going to be an answer in the vast pile of cards that is Magic the Gathering. We saw it with Mono White Initiative, and we saw it with Urza Saga. There are cards that exist in the format that are not being played right now that may be played later because they are lining up really well. So keep an eye on Disruptor Flute. Ooh, Blue Moon, Harbinger of the Seas. Yeah, I don't think this is it. I don't think this is it. Notably, this card doesn't fit in the current versions of Merfolk in Vintage. Merfolk in Vintage is actually a deck that is playing Urza Saga and shying away from blue mana costs. That's to be said. You could, of course, change back to the less powerful versions of Merfolk that did have a lot of blue mana cost, and they played lords, and they were less explosive and had less grind potential. That would be a place where I think this would absolutely just probably see play as a 4 of. I just don't think that shell is worth playing. And I really believe that the innovations that Not Me and I made on the Merfolk shell in terms of off-color Moxen and Urza's Saga and swapping out Lords for things that only cost 1 blue pip actually made the deck a lot more viable in Vintage, where this is going back towards an archetype that doesn't really have the power level to compete. That being said, one of the nice parts about the both versions of Merfolk is they are all blue, so they have beautiful blue counts for Force of Will. They have access to Wasteland, and this will be an additional access to a card that deals with Urza Saga and Bazaar Baghdad and Mishra's Workshop. So I would keep an eye out on that. I don't think this will be played in any kind of like blue controlling deck or even like a blue stomping deck, because blue mana cost is really prohibitive. It's not like you can power this out on turn 1 with an Ancient Tomb or double Moxen, or like, I mean, obviously you have Sapphire, but like one of the very nice parts about Magus of the Moon is that it's 2 in a red and not like 1 red. I think Magus of the Moon wouldn't even be close to playable if it was 1 red, and at 2 red it does sometimes see play in these different, you know, red stompy decks. So it is blue though, so it does pitch to Force of Will. One of the things is turning non-basic lands into islands instead of non-basic lands into mountains. Is islands are much better in Vintage. Islands are going to let you cast Ancestral and all of your blue cards. So whereas Magus of the Moon would turn all of their like blue lands into like blue dual lands into mountains, and then they couldn't cast any of their Ponders, Preordains, Ancestrals, whatever. This card is just going to turn their volcanic islands into islands, and they'll still be able to do things. So I actually don't have a lot of hopes for the Harbinger of the Seas. Harbinger of the Seas? I thought it'd be a bringer, but it's not. Harbinger. Got him. Nadu. I like Nadu. Nadu is very cool. This is a very unique effect. 1 green blue for a 3/4 flyer is a very large statted bird wizard. Good cavern types here, especially wizard as the one I'm more referring to. Creatures you control have, when they are targeted by a spell or ability, reveal the top card of your library. Land, you can put it into the battlefield. Otherwise, you can put it into your hand. Not drawing and putting lands in the battlefield untap. However, this ability only triggers twice each turn. However, it is only triggering twice each turn for each creature, because this is giving creatures you control this static trigger text here. This is causing a lot of hubbub in Legacy forms for being very good in the Cephalid Breakfast deck, which uses Cephalids and Shukos to target things over and over for 0 mana. And gain a lot of card advantage that way. Theoretically, that could also be true for Vintage. This is a blue card. You could play it. One of the biggest problems with this card in Vintage is it costs 3, which means you are cutting Luris for that. So I really liked the Cephalid Breakfast ports into Vintage that played Luris. The problem with those ports is they were too graveyard reliant. And this card would actually solve the graveyard reliant issue. But I don't know if cutting Luris is like reasonable. Luris is that good that you should always be trying to play Luris if you can possibly play Luris. So cutting Luris, rough, but this card does solve one of the issues with the old shell, in that it was very weak to graveyard hate. I always thought that the Cephalid Breakfast deck should be pretty playable in Vintage. The upgrade of Luris is extreme, but one of the problems is it either has an artifact. One of the biggest problem is it uses the graveyard, and if you use the graveyard in Vintage, it can come back to bite you really fast, because people need to play 6, 7, 8 Bazaar answers. Everyone has graveyard answers. If you're in Legacy, someone might only have like 2 pieces of graveyard interaction. In Vintage, everyone has 6 to 10. So if you're like reliant on the graveyard, it becomes difficult. Also, if you're playing the Shuko thing, then you become susceptible to like an anti-artifact stuff. So it had some problems in just like the way it cross-sectioned with the format. So I will probably try this card though. I think it's a unique ability that I'd love to play with a few times at the very least. I think it plays very well with Urza Saga Shuko, and I'd be willing to give it a shot. I'm going to give it a shot in a vintage league, absolutely. Mutated cultist. This is part of the commander set. I don't think this is going to see vintage play. Oh, actually, that's not how I want to phrase this. This will see vintage play, especially in paper events like Eternal Weekend, because it's part of a budget style, mono black dark depths turbo depths deck. If you cast this spell at a very, very castable cost, 2 colorless and a black, it's a cast trigger, so it is not counterable, and you will remove all the counters off of your dark depths and make a 20/20. You also have this extra piece here where you can, for every counter you removed, your next spell costs 1 less. So if you can maybe play some kind of blue-black version with, I don't know, show and tells and Emrakul's or something, then you could maybe start casting some Eldrazi. I don't know. I don't know if like this second part is a bait. It might just be that the second part of the spell is a bait, but actually like you can do things like cast a Karn. It's very interesting, the second part. I think the first part is the most important here. Just having an uncounterable, very easily castable way to turn a Dark Depths into a Merit Lodge is very good. But the second part is also interesting. So I think this is like a budget vintage option. Typically, you would play that kind of like Turbo Depths deck if you didn't have access to a lot of like, I don't know, blue power or something like that. But it's probably worth at least trying online. One of the problems is I don't really like the idea of playing Dark Depths right now with how many Wastelands are in the format. Wastelands make up something like 70% of the metagame, 65% of the metagame. So it's a little tough to be making Merit Lodges at the moment, but I think this card is powerful enough that it should be attempted. Shifting Woodland is part of a cycle of rare lands that ETB tapped unless you control the corresponding type. This one has Delirium and can copy permanents in your graveyards. I would go out on a limb and say this card's probably not vintage playable. However, copying a card in your graveyard, target permanent in your graveyard, can be very good in a deck like Omniscience deck. Some kind of show and tell, Omnitel style deck. If you have a bunch of tropical islands in your deck, you can fulfill this forest cost pretty reasonably. I would say play 4 tropical islands, playing a blue-green show and tell deck. It's a little awkward because those show and tell decks don't typically get the show and tell targets into the yard. So like you might have to do some extra work to turn on Delirium and put things in your yard. And once you're putting things in your yard, then again, you become susceptible to the splash damage of Bazaar of Baghdad Hate. I just think this card is worth mentioning because I do rather like, or like the idea of different Omnitel decks in Vintage right now with the low number of Pyroblasts that are happening. I have tried them in the past and they felt close to being a real thing. So just a card to keep an eye on if you're trying to do some kind of interesting Omniscience deck. Ooh, this one's cool. I don't know if this one's good, but it's very cool, and it has the ability to be good. This is 1 black for a Saga, and this Saga is exile a card from your library, face down, and shuffle, and then on the second turn, you reveal the card, and if it's a creature card, you lose a bunch of life. And then on the third one, if the exile card is a creature card, you put it into play, and if you don't, you put it into your hand. So it's a super slow, like, what's the suspend tutor, profane tutor? It's like a profane tutor, but it has this really crazy upside of being both halves of a reanimate or, show and tell kind of style card. Show and tell, you need to have the creature in play to show and tell. Reanimate, you need to have the creature in the graveyard. This, you don't need either. You just search the creature, you pay some life, and then if this Saga made it all the way to the third turn, you just put it on the battlefield. And this is a 1-card Atraxa. Atraxa being the most powerful creature in Magic, paying 7 life. If you pay 7 life, and it doesn't really matter if you get an Atraxa in play. Atraxa has life linking, 7/7 flying, master of death. I don't really know. The card does so many things. The question is this too slow? And will it being in play cause you to just like lose 7 life and then lose your Avacyn, your Saga? And those questions are hard to answer without gameplay. But in Vintage, at least, this card can be played on turn 1 with Dark Ritual very easily. So if you're playing this on turn 1 and then on turn 3, you are getting an Avacyn. That seems reasonable to me. That seems like a pretty good combination. And obviously, you don't need a Dark Ritual. You can cast this in other ways. But this definitely makes Dark Ritual a bit more interesting. It's also a pretty light splash in your deck, like 1 Atraxa and some number of these cards, because if you like draw your Atraxa, you can still just tutor up another card that's not a creature and it's just a slow tutor. It's not exactly something you're super interested in doing. It's not really a vintage power level play, but I do think that the Atraxa part is a vintage power level play. Now, that being said, enchantments are the target of a lot of removal these days, thanks to Urza Saga. So it might be that you are putting it too much into one card and it's too slow, and you end up like taking 7 damage and not getting your card. But I would be very interested to see some decks put Atraxa into play with this, and see if they're actually viable in Vintage. It'd be very, very cool to see. White Orchid Phantom, a white enters the battlefield, destroys a non-basic, and then the controller gets a basic land, a little bit of tapped. So it's a little bit better than a Ghost Quarter, but it's on a creature Spirit Knight. My guess is it doesn't see any play. But the reason I bring it up is because for a long time, there were mono-white Hate Bears decks that used Lurrus. And I'm very much always thinking about, can we play a Lurrus aggro deck that is not blue? Now, usually the answer is no, because it's just it does end up being a bit more of an interactive and has more options than a mono white initiative deck, but it definitely lacks the closing power of that deck. This is a 2/2 flying first strike. It does a lot of work as a body. Obviously, if it had 3 power, it'd be like a lot more exciting, but probably too good for other formats. But I believe having another creature that destroys Urza Saga is something that that deck would be interested in. And so something to keep an eye on if you're Grim or another mono white Lurrus aficionado. Like I said, I would assume this sees does 0 play, but if you are very specifically looking to make a Lurrus aggro deck, this is a card that might slot in there. We have a series of very interesting cards here that could change the future of the worst deck in Vintage. This is a series of flipped modular untapped lands. So these are not lands on the front, and they are colorful, and they flip into lands, or I guess you can play them as a land, I should say. Two faces of this card. Oops All Spells is technically the worst Vintage deck that is still tracked by our metrics, something in the 40s win rate wise. But these cards should be an extreme upgrade to Oops All Spells and maybe see play, depending on the color, in other decks around the format that are looking to play pitch spells, specifically forces, but also maybe elementals. This is the black one. It's got a nice, very nice creature side here with a 3-mana Bajuka Bog effect that is also a 3/1. And then, like I said, this is can enter the battlefield untapped by paying 3 life, which is like the Mythic Cycle that is seeing play in Vintage right now. Seagate Restoration and Amaria's Call, I think that's the name of the white one, are both seeing play in Vintage decks right now. So the fact that these cards are going to be upgrades on those cards, as they will be not Mythic, they'll be more castable, low-costing threats here. Very important, and cards that you should be keeping an eye on, especially in deck building. If you want to play Grief in your deck, this might be a card you're looking for. If you want to play Chrome Mox in your deck, this might be a card you're looking for. This is the black one, and then this is the blue one. 1 blue, return target spell or non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So bounce a spell on the stack or a permanent that is not a land in play. This is a very, very reasonable spell to have in your deck. I can see this being played over Seagate Restoration in Jewel. Obviously, this card is extremely hard to cast in Jewel, and you're probably not casting it most of the time. But most of the time, you're using this as a blue land that makes blue mana, or a blue card that pitches the Force of Will. And sometimes you can even use this as a way to bounce a Null Rod, or counter a spell off of your Jewel that, after you like do a medium combo but don't go all the way. I'm not saying that this is like the end all be all. This is going to break Jewel or anything, but I think this is a spell that Jewel wants. This is the kind of effect. Jewel would really have liked this to be, I don't know, 3 in a blue, maybe 2 in a blue sounds a little bit too good. So like 3 in a blue might have been even better, because 2 blue is very hard, but you should keep an eye on this. And of course, in Oops All Spells, this is a blue one. Obviously, black is the more important color in Oops All Spells, but maybe you can make a mono blue Goblin Charbelcher deck with this card being a very pivotal piece. You're adding a ton of blue backside land cards. So maybe there actually is a working Charbelcher deck. Charbelcher is a very historic card in Vintage, can definitely be used. So I would keep an eye and maybe even try to build different versions of Oops All Spells or Goblin Charbelcher, or just your normal Chrome Mox decks in Vintage Jewel. But also more this card. This one is less good than the other cycle because it enters the battlefield tapped. However, this makes blue and black, which is something that Oops All Spells wants, which is something that Goblin Charbelcher probably wants, depending on the version. And its casting spell outside is very good. Like, this is 4 mana, search for an instant or card with flash. There's a lot you can get with this in Vintage. Obviously, number 1 being probably Ancestral Recall, but there's tons of other things you can get as well. I don't know if being so good on this side makes up for the fact that it's tapped on this side, but blue-black, searching for instance, this sounds like Oops All Spells Charbelchers to me. Nice casting cost here at 3 blue or 3 black. This is a large quantity of cards for a struggling deck, so it'll be interesting to see if anyone picks it up and does well. That being said, all of those cards are not the best flipped land in the set, and this card is probably going to see the most guaranteed play of any card in all of Modern Horizons 3, and that's because it is a direct upgrade to Mono White Initiative. Mono White Initiative is going to get this flip land that on the creature side is a 4 mana human 2/2 with a disenchant. Not exactly a disenchant because it only hits opponent's artifacts or enchantments. But which disenchanter? This enchanter? Something like that. Oh, I blew it. Which enchanter? This enchanter. There we go. God. Yeah, we're not editing this. This is just spewing. This is the number 1 locked in 100% guaranteed Vintage staple in the set. There's no doubt in my mind. This is just, I would start and slam 4 into Mono White Initiative. It's going to go as a white land to cast your spells. It's going to go as a white card to cast on your Chrome Mox. You can cast it off of Cavern on Human, and it kills Urza's Saga and Oath of Druids. This card's extremely good. Guaranteed Vintage staple right here. This card is not a guaranteed Vintage staple, but it could see play. Wrath of the Skies, very interesting. X white sorcery. You get X energy counters and then pay any number of energy counters and destroy each artifact, creature, and enchantment with mana value less than or equal to the amount of energy paid. Now, white is a tough casting cost. Don't get me wrong. White is a hard casting cost. However, this effect is very strong. Hitting all... If you pay this for 2 mana, say X is 0, you get to hit every Moxen and Urza Saga. It's very similar to a card that I've used to great success to beat Urza Saga decks, which is Pernicious Deed. And it has a lot of versatility in how it scales up. This can be just a true Wrath. the more you put into it, or it can be as low as simply a wiping of Urza Saga and artifacts. So this card has some versatility to it. It is powerful, and it does line up very well against the current Urza Saga, Lura Saga metagame. Will it see play? It's a little hard to say. White is tough. It's almost like this card would actually, you can't play this card in mono white initiative because white is not really an achievable casting cost in that deck. You don't really want this style of effect. You'd rather play like a Dauntless Dismantler. But you could play this in maybe an Esper Tinker deck, or even just a Lura Saga deck in the mirror. You sandbag some Moxen, you wipe their Moxen, and their their Urza Saga. I'm trying my best, I swear. Their Urza Saga, and that would be a very strong play. So keep an eye out for Wrath of the Skies as possible Urza's Saga, anti-Urza Saga tech. Ooh, Baby Necro. Baby Necro. So this is kind of a card people are excited about, but I am not sure I agree. And the reason is, I actually think Necropotence was pretty close to being able to be unrestricted in the past few years. Necropotence is far worse in the Doomsday deck than casting Doomsday is. And a lot of times, Necropotence will not win you the game, and sometimes it even loses you the game when you cast it. Obviously, some of the Elder Wizards are going to tell you that's a skill issue. You're not drawing the right number of cards off your Necropotence, and that is true. Typically, Necropotence is a hard card to play. But I felt like Necropotence was definitely worse than doing other things with your triple black mana. That being said, this card is worse than Necropotence. It's one of those like fixed cards for Modern. Instead of putting cards in your hand at the end step, you are paying life and drawing cards. Now, drawing cards has upsides, but it has more downsides typically. Say you have a Shieldred in play, it's a nice upside. You're going to actually gain double the life that you paid. But if your opponent has a Bowmaster, they're going to start pinging you. And if they have a Hull Breacher, you can't draw any cards. So there's a lot of risk in Vintage to using draw cards instead of put cards in your hand. A second part of this is maximum hand size 5. 5 is a lot less than 7. I know, but like sometimes when you draw, 10, 12 cards, I should say, with Necro, and then you have to trim down to 7. Sometimes it can even be hard on 7 to like make a Vintage power level combo that's going to win through interaction. Making a Vintage level power combo that's going to win through interaction on 5 sounds very hard to me. I am very concerned that 5 does not typically make you a hand that is going to win on the next turn. Because I found 7s can sometimes be problematic. So it's a card that people should keep their eye on. It is a powerful card. It could spawn, long style storm decks. It's possible. I would say it's not likely, is what I would say. But it's definitely a card to keep your eye on, and definitely a card worth brewing around. Like, this is a powerful card, don't get me wrong. Necropotence is an extremely powerful card. It's restricted for a reason. And even this fixed version of it is strong. But is it strong enough to be a consistent Vintage deck? I'm doubtful. This one's probably also not strong enough to be a consistent Vintage deck, but it is a card we're definitely going to try because it's so cool. This is a blue, not blue, but I mean, it's probably going to be in a blue deck, let's be honest. 1 in a green enchantment on the end step. If you have a creature, you can look at your top 7 cards, and then you may choose to sacrifice a creature. If you do, you can put a creature from among those cards that cost X or less, where X is the number of the mana cost of the sack creature plus 1. So it's kind of, a birthing pod, survival of the fittest style card, but you have a lot of versatility here where you're looking at your top 7 before you're sacrificing, and you can choose what you want to sacrifice, though you do have some restrictions here, and you have to go exactly 1 up the chain, so that's a little challenging, but it's something to think about if you can maybe do. There was I made a Neoform affinity deck at one point in life. It was a blue-green affinity deck that transformed. What was it transforming? Transforming like Mirror Enforcers and Thought Monitors into Grizzlebrands or something. it was something very, very degenerate and very, very fun. So I would like to maybe see something like that here as well. Thought Monitor is a nice overcosted card that can get you really high up the chain. But this card might not lend itself to those like very strict 7 to 8 kind of plays, because you might want to have a variety of cost here so that you can find the best one. That being said, I did play a league with the there's an enchantment version of this card. It's blue and a green. You can sack enchantments to get creatures that cost 1 more, and I actually had a lot of fun with it. I don't think it ever made it to a video, because the deck was not very good. But it did produce some cool gameplay. So I think this will definitely become a vintage league and a video on my channel in the future. So if you're interested in that, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Are those the things? I mean, you don't need to comment, but you should subscribe, right? Subscribing will help you find the Birthing Ritual video when it comes out. Ooh, another fixed card. This is the fixed version of Recurring Nightmare. A card that is a cube staple, but doesn't really see constructed play recently. The one reason I want to bring this card into the spotlight is because it is a Lurrisable Recurring Nightmare. This is playable in your Lurrus deck as a 2-cost. You get 3 energy, and then you can pay energy to sack a creature, return this card to your hand, and return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield only as a sorcery. So what I was thinking is maybe you have a more graveyard-oriented Lurrus deck. Maybe you even play that Grist from earlier, and this would let you have a powerful main deckable way to return Lurrus. Something I've been trying to theory craft recently is I kind of believe that all Lurrus decks should play a way to bring back Lurrus, and there's lots of ways you can do that. Reanimate, Unearth, Yogwill, Savine's Reclamation. This would be another one up that alley and would kind of go very well with some kind of more graveyard-oriented creature deck. But something to think about. I would say this one's an unlikely vintage card, but it's a card that I'm going to brew with, and we'll probably do at least a couple of videos trying to figure out if we can make this card work in a Lurrus deck in vintage. Ah, the whale. Yeah. Probably not. But it is blue, and I'm pretty sure it's going to stay in play for a long time in most games of vintage. So, if you think a turn 1 7/5 blue creature would make a good threat in a vintage deck, this might do it. I'm thinking, you know, Mana Crypt, Island, play a whale. Your opponent goes, they play 2 spells, your whale goes back up to 3. You go and you play, I don't know, another Moxen and a cantrip, another Moxen, another Moxen. It stays around. I think it could stay in play for a while. And there are other uses of Proliferate. Proliferate to speed your opponent's Urza Saga through so that they don't get Saga tokens, or to speed yours through so you can get closer to the search. Obviously, planeswalkers. There are ways you can make this Proliferate do more than just keep your whale in play. So, is this a vintage card? Probably not, but could it be a vintage card? Maybe. So I'm probably going to brew with it. We'll do at least one video with a whale. I like to, when I do these videos, if I was only going to give you the things I was sure or were very likely to be vintage cards, you'll have a 2-card, 3-card video, right? But I'm going to give you the things that are most likely to become videos on my channel and most likely to be brewed around by, at least by me. So there's a whale. I hope you're happy. And finally, Vexing Bauble. I actually am not going to talk about Vexing Bauble in this video because I released a 35-minute dissection of this card in terms of vintage on my channel last week. Definitely go check out that video. I'll probably put a link somewhere up in the corner, down in the bottom. There'll be a link, as long as I'm not lazy. This is the card everyone is talking about for vintage from Modern Horizons 3. Will this card be a game-breaking, meta-breaking card? It could be. And I have 35 minutes talking about why it could or could not be on that other video, so make sure you go check that video out. And that will bring us to the end of Modern Horizons 3 spoiler season. Actually ended up with a pretty solid list of cards here. A nice range of cards that only Justin will try, cards that might see play in the hands of others, and cards that will be guaranteed staples. I will say that this Modern Horizons is a lot weaker than previous Modern Horizons. With the exception of something like the Bauble or the Disenchanter, this set, primarily because the force cycle, the pitch cycle, is the flares, and I don't think the flares are vintage level cards. In comparison to the forces that were extreme vintage cards and the pitch elementals, which were playable vintage cards, the flare cycle looks to be very niche and underpowered. Probably because modern players were not so happy about the previous set of pitch cards. That being said, I think this is a pretty appropriate power level for an extended set. I would probably like more power, just because I want to see more new cards in vintage and have more brewing capability. But it seems like they focused a lot of this set this time towards reprints into modern that are new to modern, and commander reprints into modern that are new to modern, and these kind of things. A lot of fixed modern cards, fixed recurring, nightmare, fixed necropotence. Those are typically not going to find their way into vintage, but they might. And we talked about a couple of them earlier today. So more vintage content on this YouTube channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.